Να καλωσορίσουμε τον κύριο Μανδραβέλη και τον κύριο Καλύβα.
Βεβαίως, ο Στάθης Καλύβας, ο οποίος απομακρύνεται περιέργως τώρα και δεν ξέρω γιατί, δεν θέλει και πολύ συντονισμό. Τον ξέρουμε όλοι από τα best seller που έχει γράψει «Καταστροφές και θρίαμβοι», τα εμφύλια πάθη που έχει συγγράψει με τον κύριο Μαραντζίδη και βεβαίως τη στήλη του στην Καθημερινή της Κυριακής. Να την παίρνουμε, έτσι. Αυτό ήταν διάλειμμα για διαφημίσεις. Λοιπόν, έχουμε μόνο μισή ώρα, οπότε δεν θα πω πολλά για το βιογραφικό του, γιατί χρειάζεται πάνω από μισή ώρα. Επομένως, θα πω τα τελευταία. Είναι καθηγητής διακυβέρνησης στην έδρα Gladstone του Κολεγίου All Souls στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης και η τρέχουσα έρευνά του, όπως και παλιότερα, αφορά τις παγκόσμιες τάσεις, την πολιτική βία και τους εμφύλιους πολέμους. Ο Στάθης Καλύβας έχει το λόγο και θα έχει και μια πολύ ωραία παρουσίαση, την οποία θα παρακολουθήσω και εγώ από κάτω.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. And I'm going to discuss today populism, which is a question that everyone thinks about. There's an enormous global debate about what it is, what causes it. And what I'm going to try to do today is very simply try to assemble a lot of the research, which is emerging research, explaining the causes and the dynamics of populism, reflect on it, reorganizing it a little bit, and giving you, hopefully, food for thought. So what I'm going to do is give you a very brief definition of populism. Always, we need to define it. And then I'm going to headline this presentation by discussing the basic story that is being told about populism, which is the economic story, the economic causes of populism, which raises 5 puzzles, which I'm going to discuss very briefly one by one, and then present 2 alternatives that may try to reconcile those contradictions. And finally, give you a few concluding thoughts. So it's going to be a bit compressed, and I'm hoping to be able to do it all in 30 minutes. What is populism? What I'm going to do today is narrow down what we discuss and define as populism by looking primarily at advanced industrial democracies, not the developing world, not Eastern Europe, and focusing very much on electoral insurgencies, how and why voters move away from mainstream parties. And we can disaggregate that a bit further and find 3 dimensions in terms of populism. First is the question of distrust of the establishment, a distrust of the elites, and distrust of political institutions. The second one is in terms of discourse, very big critique of the elites and praising something that is called the virtuous people. And the third one is behavior, which is abandoning establishment, mainstream parties, and support emerging parties at the fringes, and also supporting unconventional political leaders. So that's very simple, I think, very simply the essence of the phenomenon of populism. What is the baseline research, and why do I describe economic research as baseline? I think some of the best papers have been written trying to connect economic developments with this phenomenon that I just described. There are basically 2 ideas. There are long-term processes. Globalization creates deindustrialization. The labor market channel causes people to lose their jobs and as a result to be resentful and turn against a system that can no longer deliver the economic goods that they expect. And then there's a short-term channel, which is the effects of the 2008 financial crisis, rises in unemployment, people losing their homes, and a variety of other processes. In fact, there is a lot going on. Various research projects identify slightly different channels, from welfare provision to unemployment to moving away the China effect of particular industries. And there is a lot of research on that. However, when it comes to exactly identifying individual as opposed to aggregate mechanisms, what is going on in the heads of people, how do they sort of understand what happens to them and how they translate that to a political reaction, then it becomes very complicated and we get a lot of counterintuitive results. Turn out, for example, in many papers that inequality doesn't necessarily cause a demand for a distribution. It produces a different effect. So, but very simply, the basic economic idea, which I think is extremely popular, that is being repeated in a lot of different places, is that economic shocks produce economic grievances, and economic grievances produce populism. That's very simply the basic economic channel idea. And it produces very clear policy implications. I went to many different panels today and yesterday, and one of the things that you hear people say is that if we can fix the economic problems, we can solve the problem of populism. If we can address underlying economic grievances, there's a very nice book by Barry Eichengreen just came out recently, you can actually address the problem. And what are those grievances? You can try to redress inequality through redistribution, big discussion going on today in the United States about the new Green Deal, try to improve or at least preserve the provision of services through various welfare mechanisms. It's less clear, of course, whether you can actually affect globalization and even more the emerging process of automation, which is going to cause a tremendous amount of job losses. Then it becomes very difficult. But that's basically the idea of policy implications. But I'm going to argue things are not as simple as that. That is, a number of puzzles appeared when we look at the economic channel, and if true, those questions, those issues may actually make even fixing those problems not necessarily solving the question of populism. Puzzle number one is what may be described very simply as populist politics. Everyone understands and knows that. If the economic grievances are economic, if the problem is redistribution and rising inequality, why is the response nationalistic? Why are the main political parties in advanced democracies located in the far right of the political spectrum? There is a distinction between left-wing and right-wing populism, but the reality of it is that it's primarily a right-wing nationalist phenomenon. Even in Southern Europe, which was driving leftist populism, we see a decline of that, and in fact, it's becoming very, very much, almost homogeneously so, a right-wing phenomenon, a far-right phenomenon. So why is it that we observe this kind of disjunction? It's a puzzle, it's a question. Puzzle number two, populist leaders. If the reaction is against the elite, why are populist leaders members of the elite? What explains Trump? Trump is not exactly an outsider. Many other populist leaders are insiders as well. And what is very interesting is that those leaders, primarily men, have a very characteristic, very interesting style. They tend to be very raw, very aggressive. They try to shock. They try to distinguish themselves from the established rules and patterns of civility and discourse by behaving in a way that's shocking. And what is also very interesting is that this points to a very important puzzle. It's not that people, populists, and the people who adopt populist movements are against the elite, they're against a certain type of elite. What is that certain type of elite? Basically, people in this room. Metropolitan, cosmopolitan, technocratic. That's the kind of elite populist voters do not like. So we have to understand that. It's not the elite in general. Puzzle number three is the question of cultural backlash. And the puzzle is, if it is about economics, why is it expressed in the language of culture and identity? Why do we observe this enormous geographic dichotomy between urban centers and rural centers, between exurbs and metropolitan cities, between educated people living in internationalized and globalized economic systems and people who are left behind? And what happens, and a lot of research shows that, is that, in a sense, populism is an expression of a very deep, very intense fear, the fear of the perceived, and I very much want to underline perceived, destruction of national culture, of a way of life, and of values that are very often described as traditional values, along with a very deep pessimism about the future and what is often described by psychologists as very deep status anxiety. People feel very insecure. And I think that's a very important point to emphasize. But what is very interesting in a lot of research is that this insecurity is not economic, primarily economic, even though it has economic elements. It's not primarily economic in its essence. It's about subjective social status, how people feel about themselves, and it goes beyond economic disparities. And here comes, I think, a very interesting link, which is the question of immigration, which is very often associated with the issue of identity and culture. What do we see about immigration? why are people and why are populist movements and populist leaders so obsessed about immigration? If you look about Salvini in Italy, it's the #1 issue. Le Pen managed to emerge emphasizing immigration. The question of the wall in the United States and Trump is at the forefront of the agenda. Why is immigration so big? Now, the natural reaction to that is to say it's about labor market security. Immigration causes job loss. People compete against individuals who are willing to take lower salaries, and that produces a sort of downward spiral that creates this anxiety and those effects. Well, it turns out this is not necessarily the case. We have a lot of research on immigration, and what seems to be going on is, first of all, a tremendous amount of distorted beliefs. You ask people how many immigrants live around you, in your community, in your country, they always overestimate the number of immigrants around them. There is a systematic bias in perceptions. And so reality is becoming skewed, which is a very big problem. And so and here's the rub, I think, a very important finding in the literature on immigration, which is that it is unrelated to personal economic status and even to self-interest. The findings in that research point out that anti-immigration attitudes are a reflection of the previous puzzle of cultural and identity concerns, primarily rather than economic ones. So we have to ask ourselves exactly what is going on. There is a sense that globalization is perceived not necessarily just as an economic process causing job loss and economic insecurity, but also as a cultural process changing people's values, creating the sense of dread about the future. Finally, puzzle number 5, the non-political dimension of populism. What do I mean by non-political dimension? Populism as an expression of mistrust of elites is expressed in a variety of other fields. I'll give you 2 examples. The first one, as you probably know, is the anti-vaccination movements. It has nothing to do with politics. People stop believing that an essential scientific advance is actually good for them. In fact, they believe it's dangerous, and even more so that the belief or the idea that it's good for them is the result of some sort of conspiracy against them. And there are a number of studies now emerging trying to capture that very strange phenomenon, which is not directly associated with politics, and they find a high correlation with populist attitudes in other dimensions, and also the similar kinds of elements driving it, the mistrust of expertise. And here we're not talking about elites, political elites unable to deliver goods. We're talking about very deep disbelief and mistrust against scientific experts. The second element is the growing popularity of conspiracy theories. Again, there are many studies, and in fact, a recent one that shows that it's a very big driver of the Gilets jaunes movement in France. And the idea there is that conspiracy theories are driving what people believe about their grievances. That these are not real necessarily grievances, they are driven by these obscure beliefs in the sense that something is going on behind the scenes that people cannot observe, and therefore they have to turn against it. In sum, if we want to summarize these 5 puzzles, we have a lot going on beyond economics. And this is, I think, very important to emphasize, because if this is true, it has implications for economics. Even if we can solve the economic issues, if this is true, we're not going to be able to solve the problem and the root causes of populism. And so I think the deeper question we have to ask ourselves is, under what conditions are people going to be able to trust the elites as opposed to systematically mistrust them? I think this is a more fundamental question, perhaps. And perhaps the identity and culture channel, rather than economic channel, is where we have to focus on. So in the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to emphasize 2 aspects of that on the sources of anti-elitism. One traditional or automatic reaction we may have is to rescue the economic channel. And there are 2 ways to do that. The first one is to argue that culture and values are in fact epiphenomenal to economics, that what drives people is economics and culture is just a reflection of this economic insecurity and anxiety. It's an argument that economists like very much, obviously. But as I sort of figured out by reading a lot of the evidence, psychologists and sociologists challenge very much on the basis of very solid evidence. The second argument is false consciousness, the traditional Marxist argument that people believe in things that are wrong for them because they don't understand better, they don't know better, which is also not a very good argument because it leads us to underestimate what is going on and perhaps to focus on things that are not the most important ones. So I want to stress the non-economic dimensions of globalization and change, and therefore elite mistrust. And what I'm going to talk about very briefly is media. People have discussed that very much, so I'm not going to say too much, but I'm going to show you some aspects that I think are important and perhaps underemphasized. And the second one, and I'm going to close with that, is democratic politics and the nature of democratic politics, which I think is not getting a lot of attention, but I think is crucial. What do we know about media? There's a lot of research on that. It is becoming very important, a very important field of investigation and research. We find that there is a correlation between beliefs in conspiracy theories, beliefs in that the elites are bad, and the rise of the internet and social media. And in fact, in my field of research, which is the study of conflict, we have a very striking result, which is that the majority of people who became radicalized in favor of ISIS in the United States became radicalized through the consumption of social media and expressed it publicly. So there is a connection there. There is something about the digital or the technology revolution in the media field that for some reason creates those effects. It's not just a reflection of those effects. So let me emphasize three different dimensions in which they matter. And I think the literature on the study of media is becoming very sophisticated and trying to study each of them in a separate, even though they're related, ways. The first one has to do with the standard idea of coordination of discontent. The whole Gilets jaunes movement, the Indignados movement in Spain, or our own Kathimerini in Greece, there was a lot of coordination going on in a sort of horizontal way, in a way that wasn't possible before when the media were much more vertical. People can identify with others, come together, work together. There was a very big argument about the Arab Spring and how that was the result of this kind of process, the ability of people to, in a sense, mobilize from the grassroots. The second one is more deep, and I think very interesting, which is the expression itself of grievances is the result of this new media. How do we know that? We have studies about belief distortion, conspiracy theories, for example. People come to believe things that are not true because somehow others that they trust online tell them that they're true. That has to do a lot also with the process of scientific misinformation. That's exactly how people who study the process of scientific misinformation find that people form mistaken opinions about science. And finally, also, we have the very big issue that was discussed in various panels yesterday about misinformation that's directed from the top, primarily via states. The question of state-sponsored trolling, for example, is a very big issue. The so-called Russian collusion in the American elections, the effect of trolls and bots on the Brexit referendum outcome, etc. And finally, going even deeper, and I want to emphasize that very much, is that the very experience of social media may actually create in people not beliefs about their grievances, but make them aggrieved in and of itself. And there is a very interesting channel here, which is what social media do is it creates a wave of constant, perpetual comparison, where people see what others do in their lives, and they see others having happier and more fulfilled lives, so they think from themselves, and that creates a tremendous amount of unhappiness and dissatisfaction. And that is a powerful effect that we have a very difficult time putting our finger on, and may be associated with this older argument by Nietzsche, Arendt, and other thinkers, what they call ressentiment, the resentment and the envy that people feel. That is, at the very essence, very closely and very obvious, very closely associated with the populist idea, and very obvious very often in that. So a lot of the resentment against who? The cultural elites, because they have good lives, may be, in a sense, generated through this very mechanism of the media. Let me close by discussing democratic politics, which I think is very important, very overlooked, and perhaps give us a glimmer of a more optimistic sense. There is a lot of discussion and a very big belief that the moment we're living today is a moment of political paradigm shift, that liberal democracy, in a sense, may be over or may be in the process of radical transition and transformation. It's a system that can no longer fulfill its role, that modern democracy is either going to disappear or is going to have to be transformed in radical ways, very much in an authoritarian direction. And of course, the examples of people like Erdogan or Orban are often presented as examples. And here, I think, the importance of looking at advanced democracies as opposed to developing countries makes a difference, because I think the institutions of those states are fundamentally different. So almost everyone, there's almost a consensus, a pessimistic consensus, that's it, it's over. But is it correct? And I want to challenge that belief by discussing the essence, what I think is the essence of democratic politics. Now, that belief that democratic liberal democracy has reached its limits is based on two key assumptions. The first assumption is the idea that democracy has to be based on a centrist consensus. The second assumption is that the centrist consensus correlates historically with democratic stability. That is, traditionally, historically, democracies survive because there are systems of consensus. So let's examine each of those assumptions in turn. The first one is, in a sense, inspired by a long tradition in political theory, political philosophy, and the history of political ideas that sees democracy primarily as what people describe in that field an agonistic spectacle, a spectacle of competition. What is democracy? What is democratic politics? Is organized spectator sports. You have two teams that compete. People associate with those teams, they take interest in that, and they enjoy it, and then identify themselves with both the parties and the system that produces it. And there is a very strong anti-elitist tradition in that type of democratic politics. Anti-elitism is part and parcel of democratic politics. It's not something that's outside democratic politics. In fact, people who study these areas speak of Machiavellian democracy as a populist, citizen-empowering, and anti-elitist democratic tradition. And they identify different moments in the history of states and the history of democracies in which this trend becomes very obvious and very powerful. However, politics in advanced democracies in the last 30 years or so has grown very bland. There is a decline of grassroots presence of political parties. People no longer take an interest in politics and establish parties. There is a convergence towards the center, very much so that people think that the parties in the center, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, the center-right and the center-left, have become very undistinguishable. And this is a trend that very much grew out of the Cold War. The Cold War, in a sense, killed a fundamental root of competition in Western politics, the competition between a liberal agenda and a more socialist agenda. So, as a result of that, politics has lost its agonistic, spectacular dimension, and in fact, populism is bringing that back. Rogers Brubaker, who is a very important sociologist, has written about the antagonistic repoliticization of democratic politics that populist parties are bringing back. And this is not a distortion of democracy, if we understand democracy in that perspective, but part and parcel of democratic politics. Second assumption about the centrist consensus. Is it so critical, so central to the survival of democratic systems, historically speaking? And here I'm going to use and read to you a very short passage from Danny Roderick's, he has a paper on populism and globalization from 2017. He says, until recently, and I'm emphasizing that, it looked as if the world's economic and political order was set on an established, predictable course. The world's economic political order appears to be at an inflection point with its future direction hanging very much on the balance. So up to now, he says, Danny Roderick, we lived in a world in which everything was predictable and stable. Now, we can no longer predict anything. And that's why we're at a paradigm-shifting moment. But is it true? Is this point true? It turns out the until recently really applies to the period after the end of the Cold War. This is when politics became very centrist. But if you look at the history of European democracies and American democracy also before that, you have a very different picture in which politics is much more agonistic and therefore associated with much more public interest and much more association with the people. So to conclude, populism is a problem. There is no denying that. It raises challenges, and in some countries, but not necessarily others, may create problems that are going to be very difficult to solve, even coming down to democratic backsliding. It degrades at the very best and threatens democratic institutions, as we see in the United States today. The channels through which populism does that are multiple and cannot be reduced to economics. So even though I don't want to take economics off the table, obviously, I want to emphasize that the complex correlations between economics and other channels should matter. However, I want to also argue that a key dimension that we need to keep in mind is the idea of democratic institutions and their strength, their ability to withstand, I think, this kind of populist challenge. And I shouldn't be saying that because it's obvious to my mind, but it's not obvious to many people, that in Greece, we've experienced that from a very obvious and very early perspective. Greece experienced a tremendous shock, losing 25% of its GDP. Everyone expected not just Grexit, but even the collapse of democratic institutions, and then democratic institutions, which in this country you cannot really argue have been the strongest or the best, proved to be extremely resilient to this crisis. So I think that populism also reflects a core feature of democratic politics through legitimation, and especially via three channels. The first one is competition. Competition is necessary and good for democratic politics, very much like competition is very good for economics and markets. And so the populist challenge is necessary to reinvigorate, I think, the political parties and the political movements who are set against populism, and we see that in the United States today. The second channel is the idea of representation. People have to think that they are represented, and they've lost that sense of representation because politics became very centrist. So populism is bringing back that connection with representation. When people like Salvini get to rule, when Donald Trump wins election, it tells people that their vote actually matters, that things are not moving in a uniform direction against what they believe, wrongly perhaps, that are their own interests. And finally, it's also a way for, I think, very healthy political elite mobility. People and political elites, politicians can grow very complacent when they don't have to compete. And very often, populism offers a vehicle to very ambitious people to enter into the political system, perhaps not from the outside of the elite, but from the outside of the political elite. Because after all, a term that political scientists used to describe politics in the post-Cold War period was cartel politics, a system that was very closed. So in a sense, what populism is doing is pushing those boundaries and bringing in people inside who may have their own ideas, dangerous ideas and intentions, but very often are domesticated by the very process of democracy itself. So I want to give you those thoughts as further food for thought, and thank you very much for your attention.